Welcome back, guys. Sorry I missed last week. I was busy traveling through time. You're like, what? Time travel's not possible. Well, let me explain with this episode. It's called Travel Back in Time with Newspapers. I know, like I said, time traveling is not possible, and it's something that all of us genealogists wish we were able to do. Well, while it may not be physically possible, there are things you can do so you can understand what it was like for your ancestor back in their time. We can experience what they experienced. How, you ask? Well, one way is by reading the newspapers from their time. Back then, the newspaper was the best way to keep up to date with everything that was going on in their town and in their state and even in the world. They had notices from when people were born, people were married, they posted election results, and even draft notices. When wars were raging on, they reported on the lives lost. And when the wars were over, they reported the celebrations. So we read the papers from their days that were circulated, and we're reading the exact same words that our ancestors were reading at that time, and we can experience what they were feeling when they read that. When I was researching my second great uncle, William Ilg, I was reading newspapers from his time, especially the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. It was during the time of World War I. William would have read about the draft notices that were put out, and he would have been reading about people that he knew. Well, I read those exact newspapers, and I felt what every mother must have felt at that time. Just fear for their sons if they were going to be drafted and what was going to happen to them once they were. Well, then he did get drafted and he was called off to war. His mother would have read about the battles that were happening. Then she would have read about the war being over. Can you imagine? When I read those papers, for a moment, I felt what Pauline, my great-great-grandmother, must have felt, thinking, oh my gosh, my son is going to be coming home. Just overwhelming joy. But then I felt heartache because I knew from reading the newspapers and the research I've done, her son would not come home. I really got into this recently again, researching my great-great-grandma's life, Pauline, and trying to understand the time period when she lived. I researched William, now I'm researching her. So I'm trying to understand what was going on in her life. And one thing I came across was the Panic of 1893. That led to the first depression of the United States, way before the 1930s depression that we're all familiar with. And by reading those newspapers, I was able to understand what was going on during that time, how people were feeling, what the economy was like, and it was like I was experiencing it like they were at that time, trying to just yearn for information and understanding on what was going on during that time. So while time travel may not be exactly possible at this point in time in our lives, the best way that we can understand what our ancestor was going through and go back to that time period is to read the newspapers. So I encourage you the next time you're researching your relative to read the newspapers from their time. Read about the headlines, things that were going on, elections that were happening, just to understand. Maybe those instances that occurred in history changed your relative's life, and maybe you'll get a glimpse into what they were doing. And that's my 2 cents. See you later.